Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to everybody who's joining us. My name is Shira, and I work at Tel Aviv University International. We're so happy to have you join us here at this wonderful event. So welcome. As you're coming in, we would love for you to use the chat function, just down in the icons over there, and let us know where you're signing in from. We would love to know where you're coming from. Hi, Carol. We're kind of neighbors. Hello, Melanie. I'm in Give a Time.
Me too.
Yes? Oh, wonderful. Melanie and Freshman, you have a good walk from the beach, I would assume. Hello, everybody. Hi, Michael. Everybody's at the beach. True Tel Aviv, true Tel Aviv.
We wanted to do a talk at the beach.
We're getting kind of close. So for everybody who's joining us, and if you are wanting to share, we would love to know where you're signing in from. We know that Zoom makes us even more global, and we are dying to know whether you are here in Tel Aviv, here in Israel, or somewhere across the world. Another Ramadan. Hey. Berlin.
Tel Aviv.
Pennsylvania. Oh my gosh, awesome. So we are branching out. Okay, so I think we could have done, a small listening party just from Ramadan, it seems like. Still keeping with the health regulations. Switzerland, awesome. New York, Germany, welcome everybody. Moscow, Italy. Florida, awesome.
Wow, Kenya.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us. Welcome. Wonderful, more Tel Aviv.
Who has their favorite drink next to them, since we usually have this in a bar setting? I have my water, but something's waiting for me afterwards.
I also have my water.
I have coffee.
Coffee.
But no Baileys yet.
No, Baileys yet.
After we'll have the Baileys.
I discovered that they sell Pims in Israel, so I recently just bought that.
It's good on ice cream.
Oh.
Coffee. Okay, Daniel, we'll go for a coffee after. Café הפוך, Maggie.
Awesome.
Shira, you say the word and we start.
All right. I mean, I think that we are ready to go whenever. So if we'd like to begin, then yes, let's go for it.
Sure. Thank
Okay.
you. So I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'm the marketing director. I'm Miri Yemini, the marketing director at Tel Aviv University International. We're hosting this wonderful online event for a change with the Tel Aviv Municipality and their Alim community host, Jill Reinach, who will be speaking shortly with us. I'd like to thank Shira, our outreach coordinator, who you'll be hearing from probably towards the end. And of course, our respectable faculty that is joining us on this panel on an expert talk on COVID-19. Because what are we talking about other than that these days? Not the weather. Dr. Miri Yemini is with us from the discipline of education, Dr. Leo Leiderman from economics, and Professor Meir Litvak from Middle Eastern history studies. And I just want to mention that this wonderful group of panelists is just a small micro example of what Tel Aviv University represents, and it represents a multidisciplinary hub of academic excellence, and this is something that is super emphasized throughout our institution, and it's felt throughout our students, through our faculty. And I hope you get a taste of that in this session. Tel Aviv University also offers over 60 programs offered in English, including full degrees, short-term programs, summer programs, etc. So if you are interested in understanding a little bit more about us, we'll have some more information at the end of the talk. So Jill, you can take it from here, and thank you again for being such a wonderful host with us.
Well, thank you, Orit. I want to thank Orit and Tel Aviv University. Put aside the fact that I work at the Tel Aviv Municipality. As a citizen of this wonderful city, I feel that we're blessed to have such an amazing academic institution. And as you said, that provides multidisciplinary education, but not only that, and tonight's an example, that you and your faculty and your team take the time to share your knowledge and wisdom with the community. Great cities of the world have great academic institutions, and we're very fortunate and blessed to have Tel Aviv University. And we're very fortunate and blessed tonight to have Leo, Meir, and Miri. We're grateful, again, as Tel Aviv Municipality and as citizens of the city, citizens of the world, all of us here together, that you've taken your time to share with us your insights and wisdom on the issues of the day. Shira, who had introduced us before, wrote wonderful marketing material to introduce this panel. And she said, in this nonstop city of Tel Aviv, where innovation is just another way of saying business as usual, Kal v'chomer, even more so these days with the COVID crisis. And before we get to the questions, the panels, all of us here also want to thank you, our amazing, tremendous audience. Orit, Shira, David, and all of our panelists, we wish we were sitting with you at the bar right now, having that cup of coffee, having that wine, having that beer, that Pimm's. We'd like nothing better. So we're that much more grateful that you've chosen to be with us here on this Zoom meeting, on your couch. And we look forward to the day where we can once again be meeting together at our local pub or cafe. And so we're grateful to all of you of our community. So let's get started. We'll start with just a general question. And of course, as Shira said, feel free to add your questions on the questions and answer. If you don't get along with that on the chat, we'll manage. Your insights are very important to us. With this situation, and given also the introduction, that all of us can learn under crisis, under times of uncertainty, and we were talking before the panel, of how to be more resilient, how to be more creative, whether it be with existing problems or new problems. So we'll start with Miri. What do you think are some insights that we can learn from the current crisis, this current period, looking forward?
Thank you, Gillette. Perhaps introduce myself first, and I will let my colleagues the opportunity to introduce themselves, and then I'll answer your question. So my name is Miri Yemini, and I'm a faculty member at the School of Education at Tel Aviv University. I'm speaking with you from Berlin, where I spent my sabbatical year working at the Freie University of Berlin. So I have a comparative angle, both concerning this crisis and in general, that I would love to share with you. I was born and raised in the former Soviet Union in Ukraine, and I have been studying math and biology and chemistry. Then my PhD is actually in bio-nanotechnology. And I also have MBA in entrepreneurship. But today, I am exploring the fields of sociology of education, and this is my academic profession today. I'm asking questions about inequality and access and globalization. I often look into the various levels of education system and trying to understand what can be done better to increase the opportunity to wider participation, and how basically we as scholars and as teachers can do better job in the field of education. Leo?
Yes, thanks, Miri. Hello, everyone. My name is Leo Leiderman. I'm a professor at the School of Economics and the Kohler School of Management at Tel Aviv University. I deal mostly with issues related to international macroeconomics, international finance. Some of my previous research dealt with economic and financial crisis. And so for me, this is a very challenging and exciting time. I think especially given that this is a completely different crisis than the Great Depression of 1929 in the USA, or the subprime crisis of 2008, or the Japan crisis of 1989. And you know, there are new horizons and there are new themes and new dilemmas. In my research, I also take a policy perspective. I have been at the Bank of Israel at the top policy-making position for 5 years. This is the central bank in Israel, and I have been an advisor to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in Washington, D.C., also dealing with different countries, different policies, and so on. I'm also the chief economic advisor of Bank Hapoalim, which is the largest commercial bank in Israel. And so there is also the market perspective. And so I guess I try to do a blending of some academics as a background, and then discuss, hopefully with common sense, some policy implications and some market and financial implications. So let's move on to Meir.
Hi, good evening. Meir Litvak. I'm the Department of Middle Eastern History. My field is Iran, mostly, and also religious movements in the Middle East and nationalism. I have been the director for the Alliance Center for Iranian Studies for 9 years. And right now I'm free just to teach and work. What I do mostly is the issue of relations between religion and politics, religion and society, and again, in ideology and society. My interest in the COVID crisis is that the Middle East has been undergoing a major turbulent period in the past, since 2011, wrongly called the Arab Spring, which in fact was, I would call it more an Arab disaster or an Arab winter, considering the agony and the destruction that took place in the Middle East. And now the COVID crisis would only add to the pains of the Middle East, which begs the question of how it would affect the region, affect us here in Israel. We are part of the region. Whatever happens in the region has direct implication on us in Israel. The question of, usually the discussion of medicine and society has been a very important topic of historians, not so much historians of the Middle East, but it has become a major issue, which we should also take into consideration is the issue when we discuss the COVID crisis, but we should not forget that the Middle East has experienced other crises in the region in recent years, socioeconomic, and for instance, we should not forget that there is a climate crisis, okay, which has not been shoved out because of the COVID crisis. In fact, it may exacerbate because of the COVID crisis. All of these developments have, again, direct impact on our life. So what we're not talking about is history that belongs to some distant past that has, in some old books, but something that is dynamic, alive, and affects our life here in Israel, and I would say all over the world.
Shall I answer your question now?
Yes, that would be wonderful. Shira, did you want to say something first?
Yes, so to everybody who is participating with us on the Zoom session, please note that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You're welcome to put in your questions because we will be opening the floor to your questions towards the end. So you're welcome to put them anonymously or whatnot to all of our live watchers on Facebook. We will be sending your questions here too. So feel free to write them in the comments if you're watching live from Facebook. And with that, Miri, take it away.
Sure. So what can be learned from a crisis that's still ongoing? I'm not sure actually what we can learn about it in a broader sense, but I would start with a personal story. As a mother of twins, aged 13, about 3 months ago, I was called by a nurse from the international school my kids attend this year in Berlin, calling to ask to pick up my kids immediately. We were just back from our winter break skiing in Italy. And apparently that time in Germany, all people who traveled back had to come home and self-quarantine. Now we are speaking 3.5 months actually after this event. My kids are still homeschooled with blended and later it was online and later a bit blended learning. And I think that for me, in terms of education, especially looking into this pandemic sociologically speaking, I would say that we first must to outline the issues that basically change due to pandemic. For example, for each of these stakeholders, like parents and teachers and children, there are different circumstances and different consequences of this closure, whether partial or full, for prolonged periods of time. So I would say that pandemic is being sort of a mirror for us to see all kinds of difficulties and challenges that we have in general in education systems. So for example, when schools are closed, kids from lower socioeconomical backgrounds will get basically the same zero amount of schooling as children from better off backgrounds. But obviously the gaps that we can see after this prolonged closure would be larger and more pronounced within the families and children in this lower socioeconomical strata. If we sort of try to understand what happened within schools, then obviously teachers had to go online quite immediately, again, depending on the resources in their own houses, on their housing situation, and obviously in the families of the school. We can see that then when the schools were open, teachers had to comply with social distancing rules, and we obviously can see whether it was successful and how we can manage this situation. Obviously, issues like hunger and like food insecurity that were prominent before, now we can see that many of the families who relied on schools for school meals would be damaged by this situation. If we look into the parents as part of stakeholders, obviously there some will have to work and won't be able to assist their kids in schooling. There is an issue of equipment for online learning, obviously, and also questions of what should we teach in these circumstances, whether we should go on and continue with the materials and the testing regimes, or should we basically do more with our emotions and talking about how the children can manage this situation. And obviously we can see already from the research that started to come out that there are differences between various countries, obviously, and between the situation in the same country, usually based on socioeconomical differences. And I think we need to take in all this data about how schools reacted and how they reacted in various stages, with the closure, with the online learning, and with the returning of schools for partial action, and to map all stakeholders, each of the stakeholders' various effects, in order to understand what can be done in the future. Yeah, I guess I will stop here for this stage.
It's very interesting what you shared, Miri. Before we get to Leo, that what happened during this crisis, in fact, it showed the existing socio and economic disparities, whether it be across the societies within a country or across different countries, issues that probably would need to be addressed anyway and become more acute during crises. And as you shared, and the different stakeholders and how that they will have to either adapt or to change or to find different solutions. Leo, I'm sure that you have in terms of your specialty with economy and monetary policy, whether it be at the bank or on a more national or global scale, you have probably lots of similar and yet different insights as well.
Yeah, I think, you know, from my point of view, one of the things we learned is that things like this can happen, right? That we can, in spite of the great advances in technology, in science, robotics, you just name it, we can wake up one morning and the whole world is vulnerable, and the whole institutions, Wall Street, you know, the education system, the defense system, the health system, we are all vulnerable. We can be vulnerable to a pandemic. And it has been decades, if not ages since we had a pandemic of this order of importance. I think it was the Spanish flu of 1918, which was is the one that is mentioned normally. But for, you know, in terms of the world, we typically mention major shocks like World War I, you know, 1914 to 1918, World War II, 1939 to 1945. There was a Vietnam War, there was a Korean War. We in this area, we had our wars. But, you know, this is a truly global event. No matter if you are black or white, if you are Asian or from a Western country. And in some sense, this brings us as human beings to, you know, what we may call back to basics, you know, with all due respect to our aim always to improve the standard of living and to have a better vacation with our families and so on. Well, all of a sudden, the first and most important thing is your health, the health of your family, you know, the health of your country. And I think it's something that it's like a wake-up call. And as Meir said, I think we can have some climatic problems with global warming that may lead to some similar things, because you know, normally we think there is a tsunami in Asia, or there is an earthquake in Mexico, and that's a local problem. This is a global problem. So this is the first thing. The second sort of thing that we have learned, in my modest view, is that in spite of this being a global problem, we have not seen a global approach to attempting to resolve the problem. So each country is alone by choice, okay? By choice, as a political decision to deal with this. And of course, we know that each country has its own particularities. And you know, there are countries where there is more social distancing, there are countries where there is less, and so on and so forth. But you know, I would have expected, especially given the many years of globalization that we had, that there will be much more international cooperation in dealing with the crisis. And even within Europe, you know, I'm not utopian. I know that there will not be too much cooperation between Mr. Donald Trump and the Chinese government these days. But even within Europe and even within the European Union, there have been different approaches and different dilemmas and different things, and by different countries. So I guess this is interesting how, you know, at the end of the day, with all the globalization we had, it's as if the national interest is what comes first. And this is what is of interest mainly of politicians. And so, again, an important lesson for the future and the future shocks that we are going to have. I'll stop here, and I guess we will have a few rounds more.
So Meir, I'm sure that from what Leo said and from what Miri said, there are certain paradigms that have been mentioned that probably have relevance for your specialty with Iran and the Middle East, especially what was said, what Leo said now, that we've had a global problem, but there hasn't been a global approach. So Kal v'chomer, most likely in the Middle East, where within each country, and especially in Iran, so diverse and different types of regimes and so forth, we're anxious to hear your perspective. I'm looking forward.
I fully agree, and I want to start with what Leo said. First of all, indeed, the Middle East is part of the global world, and the disease reached the Middle East because of globalization. For instance, Iran-Chinese relations, Iran remained the border between Iran, or flights between Iran and China, remained open long after every other country realized that flights should be severed, and the events continued because for economic and political reasons, and that led to the spread of the disease in Iran. And the rest of the Middle East was influenced by global processes. This is one thing. Another important point is to look at the Middle East, I think, as a microcosm for the rest of the world. is the conduct of what I would call the strengths and weaknesses of authoritarian regimes versus democratic regimes in dealing with such a pandemic. One phenomenon which is found in many authoritarian regimes, but maybe also in some democratic, is the lack of truth. Authoritarian governments are used to lie to their people. If you look at the numbers, statistics, we know that they are distorted by authoritarian governments because apparently they're afraid that should they give the true picture to their peoples, that may lead to a political unrest. We know it from China apparently, but we also know it from in the Middle East. Governments were not telling the people the truth about the spread of the pandemic. They lost valuable time before actions were taken because they were afraid to tell the truth to their people. This is one phenomenon which we know. We can also see it in the fact that governments manipulate the number of casualties from the disease. We know it in several countries, inventing interesting formulas. Some people died from COVID, but other people died from respiratory problems, which of course had nothing to do with COVID, but happened exactly the same day. So then the governments can lower the number of casualties and present a better picture to their own people. This is a problem of authoritarian governments, not only in the Middle East, all over the world, but it has become much very visible in the Middle East. This is one problem. Another problem, which is again dealing with such a corona, is that pandemic, is that treatment requires a level of trust between the population and the government. Countries where there's a high level of trust were able to deal better. Countries where people do not trust their governments, are afraid of their government, hate their government, have a problem in dealing with the disease. Here you can say democracies have an advantage over authoritarian governments, unlike what we may think that, if you're a strong ruler, a strong government, you can do whatever you want. This is one problem that I think the Middle East reflects in it, but it's not only the Middle East. I would say, has implications for the rest of the world. Another problem, of course, is the difficulties that poor countries face when they deal with such a disease. Health systems collapsing under the flow of sick people. We saw tragic pictures of people lying in the streets because hospitals would not take them, of people lying on the streets before hospitals, and then hospitals are full, or in a situation like, for instance, in Egypt, where the doctors were not given basic supplies and basic equipment to protect them from the disease, on the one hand. But at the same time, we have military hospitals in Egypt that had the best equipment, but were not open to the rest of the public. So this is a second problem, but the difficulties of poor countries take another problem that poor countries face, not only in the Middle East: crowdedness. How can you achieve closure in cities where millions of people are crowded in slums, when large families live in small, crowded housing units? Closure is impossible. Self-quarantine is impossible in such a situation, which of course then exacerbates the situation in poor countries. Again, the Middle East is a reflection of a much deeper, much more serious social problem. And another problem, again, affecting the Middle East: how can you keep millions of people in closure when people do not have enough, when they have to work every day to earn their bread, because if they will not work each day, they will not be able to supply their families basic foods and basic needs. So what we are, again, and if you think of Cairo, but it's not only Cairo, it's Cairo and Mumbai and Kolkata and Rio de Janeiro. Slums that it makes it very difficult to maintain closure, and poor people have to go to work, risk their lives, risk their health, simply because they need to provide food for their families. And again, this is a phenomenon that exacerbated the situation, and I would say would have long-term implications, not only for the Middle East, but for the rest of the world. So these are some of, I would say, the very basic phenomena that you can find in the Middle East, which in my view have implications for much larger parts of the world beyond the Middle East.
Meir, it's what in addition to the fascinating in-depth analysis. There's a connection also with what Miri said before in terms of the crisis bringing to the surface or even emphasizing that much more the social and economic disparity. That is, it brought to the, when we saw the pictures on the television of the crowded slums in Cairo or what was happening in Iran. And it's interesting because in this perspective, it contrasts a little bit with what Leo said before, that the world came together in one sense and we're all dealing with the humanness of the pandemic. It's about our health, our family's health, and then our nation's health. We all have the same concerns, but you and Miri highlighted more how it showed the socioeconomic disparities. And then also in terms of, Meir, what you said about the regimes, that within democracy, many people think, and many, up until hearing your interesting words, many people said it's much easier in authoritarian regimes for them to deal with the crisis because they can just tell people what to do. But you're sharing if there's a lack of trust, it makes it more difficult, which is a very interesting insight. It's a very, very interesting insight. And rounding this up all together, looking forward, before we get to more individual questions, Miri, based on the analysis, your analysis, and also Leo's and Meir, and bringing it all together, what would you recommend the education system? Leo mentioned before, yes, we don't have this global, whether it be global leadership on the global scale or maybe even on a national scale. But b'chol zot, in any event, what would you recommend looking forward in the event that we're in the middle of this crisis, if we have either a second wave, hopefully not, but let's say that we do, and or beyond? What are the lessons that can be learned for the future?
Right, again, it's not an easy question, but however, I would like to pick up some of the words that have been said here. So one would be autonomy, I guess. So just like my colleagues discussed these different levels of governance, whether it's global or national, I would say that the key, as far as I understand the situation, for successful implications in dealing with the crisis would be autonomy. I don't think that the success will come from a top-down approach where all schools and all parents and all families and all teachers have to do the same. Simply because people are different and different communities have their own various characteristics that we should take into account. And the people who are responsible of these communities, the teachers, the school heads, they know the best how to deal with their own communities. And I believe that autonomy must be the first, basically, systematic attempt to provide various solutions. The second one is trust. I think Leo and Meir perhaps mentioned it. In order to succeed, people must trust each other. It's the same with health system, but obviously with education. When I'm sending my kids out there, I like to know that teachers really care and they really are doing their best, either online or in classroom. I think the last one would be care, perhaps. And I strongly believe that this building of this intimate and very first-hand experience that is happening in the classroom, which is, by the way, can happen online. And we saw many events when it did happen during this crisis, but this true and sincere care that teachers and children might develop towards each other, I think this would be also one of the reasons that we can see differences between systems and between schools. I would like to mention one more word about the comparison. And obviously, just like it really reminds us, comparative education scholar, these tables of PISA. Do you know what PISA is? It's the exam administered by OECD for 15 years old in order to sort of locate and compare between the performability of education systems and how this connected to the productivity and to the success of the country as a whole. And as we know that despite the media attempt to position several countries and several regions as reference society, like once people were going to Finland to learn and then to South Korea and China afterwards. But when you look into the data, you can see that the picture is much more complex than just a rank table. And when we look into the same picture of world statistics about casualties, about various impact of exposure to the virus, we can see again that so many statistical gains are there, and the context of the countries are so different. For example, here in Germany, we are not supposed to approach a doctor when we don't feel well unless we are really not feeling well. So basically, I would guess that many of the people here have been tested, would be tested positive if they were tested at all. Once in Israel, from what I understand, basically the testing regime is quite different. So when you put all this on the same table, on the same graph, you can't say too much. And that's why I really agree with Leo of going back to basics, of letting the people to be autonomic in their decisions, of trust and of care. I think these three are the real solutions to the education crisis.
Those are very interesting insights in terms of understanding that different communities need more autonomy to deal with education or the parent-teacher relationship or the blended learning, or as you had mentioned before, the issues of food insecurity in the parents and the students, and trust and care. And Leo, looking forward as well, wondering from your perspective, do these issues have ramifications for economic or monetary policy? And how, and looking forward, if we're going to have a second wave or lessons we can learn from the future, what are your insights on this?
Well, I think, you know, a first insight would be that, we need better coordination among policymakers in every, I mean, I'm speaking from the Israeli perspective. And as we know, Israel has been doing very well in terms of the number of victims, let's say, the number of deaths as a result of this pandemic. But, you know, I think that perhaps there should have been, not perhaps, I'm sure, I'm confident, there should have been a better coordination between the Prime Minister's office, the Ministry of Health, and its concern about, you know, bringing more closures and more lockdowns to, you know, to worry about the health of the population, and the Finance Ministry worrying about the impact on the economy, which is severe. Israel and the whole world is in recession this year, and this is quite unavoidable, because if you lock down people and you closed companies, at least for some time, and you closed factories, of course, and there is no international travel and there is no tourism, of course, the economy is going to suffer, and it is suffering. So I think, number one, better coordination, maybe to create an entity that sort of centralizes everything. That's number one. Number two, I think what Miri said is very important. She called it autonomy, and I agree with this. And I think, you know, the mayor of Tel Aviv, Mr. Ron Huldai, week after week has been telling the government, let me decide how to go about the schooling system in Tel Aviv, because no one in Tel Aviv knows better than me and the management of Tel Aviv, of the city of Tel Aviv, how to manage different neighborhoods, different areas within the Tel Aviv sort of district. And I think there has been sort of quite too much of a centralistic approach, you know, and yes, and maybe within the districts there are some people that said maybe maybe the director of a school, he or she should be the ones to decide which classes are getting back and which classes not, and so on and so forth. So this is one very important lesson that we learned, and it's part of this issue of coordination. And finally, I think if and when, I hope we don't have that, but if and when we have a second wave, one of the things we learned is that lockdowns should be selective. Okay, because in Israel, we had some focal points like the area of Bnei Brak or some areas in Jerusalem. And there were some other areas that were very much infected with the virus. And you had other areas where there was absolutely nothing. And to lock down those other areas would have been, it has been probably, you know, with the benefit of hindsight, too costly for the whole economy. So clearly a more, I will call it a more sort of pointed approach, you know, just a more selective approach that looks at different areas. And I think this has been developing over time, is something that we have learned from this first phase of the problem.
Amazing. So your pointed approach, Leo, it sounds like it's very applicable also to what Miri said. And before we get to Meir, we just want to assure everyone we see your questions. And after Meir has his second round at talking, we'll get to the specific questions of our important, wonderful audience. So Meir, does Leo's idea of bringing together actually what you've said previously, and Miri and himself, about the pointed approach, does this idea resonate with other Middle Eastern societies, authoritarian or otherwise, or what do you think about moving forward? What are some lessons about the Middle East? Looking forward, hopefully not a second pandemic, but looking forward.
I will be brief in one point. We did see pointed policies, by the way, in Iran eventually, when the Iranians understood that they had to shut, they divided the country to 3 zones, red, blue, green. Red, most affected zones, which they imposed closure, by the way, too late, but they did it. And there's some areas that were better off. Eventually, the Iranians understood it. The problem that was mentioned is, Miri mentioned, the need of autonomy is wonderful, but it doesn't work in authoritarian governments. The last thing that authoritarian governments would take is to give the people too much autonomy to decide for themselves. This has a major impact on the entire on governments, on authoritarian systems, and I think this would be the last resort when to allow such things to happen. In this regard, I'm less optimistic about the possibility of providing more autonomy. I think in the longer run, what I think is necessary for the Middle East is shifting priorities. Middle Eastern countries spend too many resources on the wrong things. Let's say on weapons, on buildings, etc., instead of on health, infrastructure, which will enable them to overcome such problems and threats like the COVID pandemic. It certainly requires a change of priorities in various Middle Eastern countries. Another thing which Leo mentioned before, the need of cooperation. The Middle East, again, facing not only Corona, but other crises. Many crises in the Middle East cannot be solved by each country by itself. They necessitate cooperation between countries, both in health, water, and other areas. So I think that one lesson that Middle Eastern countries should learn, again, maybe not for the very short term, but for the longer term, is the need to overcome some, I would say, short-term political considerations and give more importance to long-term social, economic, health considerations for the benefit of the entire region. Now, am I certain it's going to happen? Not necessarily, but I think this is absolutely essential if the region wants to overcome this crisis and not fall into another deeper crisis very soon after that.
Amazing. So I think your insights, and especially at the end towards shifting priorities, probably applicable to the whole entire world in terms of moving forward, that we all should perhaps, whether it be the education sector or the economic sector. We want to also turn to the questions of our audience. And I'll open up the floor. The first question we have from a wonderful gentleman named Daniel. Given that governments often here have narrow agendas, but have shown they can simply close down whole societies, and this also goes to what all three of you have said, how can individuals, companies, cities that thrive, thanks to globalization like Tel Aviv, how can they get back some of the decisional power away from the government? Which relates, also to when they had the monitoring and so forth. So I'll open up the floor to Miri, Meir, and Leo, if one of you would like to chime in on how we as individual citizens can take back some of the power that was maybe given out to the government during this time.
I can start if you allow me. I think it's a very interesting question. Probably the idea is not to take the power from the government, but rather to influence the policymakers. And at least in democratic societies, I believe what we had, including in Israel, is that the people, the business sector, are having and have had an impact on policy decisions. For example, the whole issue of helping small and medium enterprises, what's called SMEs, small and medium enterprises. It also happened in the US. Governments did not have a ready set of package of policies, of policy measures to help small and medium enterprises to deal with a crisis like this one. But it was sort of the protest by these people. These people were very vocal and were interviewed on TV, and they wrote articles in newspapers, and they spoke to the politicians. And here we are with, something that is becoming more and more important in terms of the whole policy package, which is specific measures to help small and medium enterprises, to help some individuals that work independently, okay? A dentist, a lawyer, they have two people working in their office. How does the government help them and not just a big company producing food or other stuff? So I think, again, in a democratic society, it is the role of the media, it is the role of the free opinion, to criticize, to come up with ideas, to make proposals, and so on and so forth. And I think not to take anything for granted. Of course, if there are new restrictions, we have to obey them. There is a law. But other than that, yes, there should be some open discussion on many of the things. And if the authorities are not listening to the people, there are ways of making enough noise so that people and government will realize that.
So drawing on Leo's insight, Miri.
Yeah, I would thought. Sorry.
In terms of that, maybe the focus should be switched to how do we influence the policymakers for the education sector, for example, and this connects with one of the questions for our audience, the issue of blended learning. Whether or not and we hope, God willing, the pandemic continues or not, in terms of the future of the education system, how do you think parents and communities can influence the education policy makers? As was said before, Mayor Huldai has, and not just because he's my mayor, but that how he has said that, maybe with the selective pointed approach, I know the schools best. How do you think that we, the citizens, so it connects with the first question, can influence policymakers to have maybe a more pointed approach, or maybe to turn to more blended learning? What's your take on it?
Okay, so I will, it's basically two different questions. But first, I agree with Leo on a national and regional level, but I would say that obviously laws should be obeyed, but and you know, restrictions kept. Obviously, we should have voice, and we have our voice in many countries. However, I would like to highlight the way that we as individuals and as families might cope with this situations. And you know, we had been making a lot of research on how people, basically some people were very successful in creating their own resilient sort of self-assembled bubble of their family, and how one basically can, in many much more circumstances that we imagine, can decide how happy actually he or she is. As for example, I don't know, here in Berlin, the kids from the local school went once a day individually to the U-Bahn, to the underground, to put some groceries for the homeless. And it was a small thing, just one small getting out of the whole day of no school and no other activities that all were canceled. But it brought so much happiness in so many lives. And I truly believe that we as individuals have so much choice of how we perceive the situation and what kind of messages we are taking from everything that happens to us, but also from this pandemic. How can we be more kind and more resilient and more caring, going back again to this. Regarding the online learning, well, what was happening during the pandemic? It wasn't online learning as we read in books. It was teaching online during the pandemic, when all the teachers and their own children are quarantined and closed in their homes. I don't think that we can call it as proper online learning, where we think about the context and the content. And obviously, we should invest more in various ways of teaching and learning. One of them is online. And we should do that not only because of the pandemic, but in general, because many people and everyone has their own learning style, and everyone has to be able to receive what he needs from the education system. And technology and online is one of the options, but obviously not the only one.
As a fellow parent, I very much relate to what you said about the online learning. It's not just about online books, it's also about learning also how to adapt what information is important to have, whether it be face-to-face, what information can we encourage our children to do on their own, and how to use the different technologies and so forth. And another interesting question that builds on it in a different way, and it might be something for all three of you, is in recent years, Israel has had building relationships with Asia. Moving forward, with the pandemic and beyond, do you think, whether it be economic relations or international relations, that Israel should be continuing to strengthen relations in Asia, or we should be looking to strengthen allies in other places within the Middle East and so forth? So I open this question more to Leo and to Meir, but of course, Miri, you might have insights being from Berlin, your perspective there. Meir, do you want to start?
Maybe I'll start. I will state two things. One is, beggars can't be choosers. That is, Israel doesn't have the luxury to choose big friends. It should be friends with anyone that it can. One thing. Secondly, Asia is the most dynamic now part of the world economy, and therefore it is absolutely essential for Israel to develop relations, better relations, trade relations, economic relations with Asia. Okay? China is the second economic giant in the world. Maybe it will be the first one a few years from now. And so are other East Asian countries. Israeli exports and imports from East Asia are absolutely essential. They're extremely important. That doesn't mean that it should become at the expense of other regions. Now, one thing. Second, it is absolutely essential for Israel to certainly aspire to improve its relations with Arab countries. In fact, there is a desire among certain Arab countries, and we know it officially, unofficially, among several Arab countries, to improve their relations with Israel. We see it recently in the appeals of the ambassador of the UAE to the Israeli public and other statements by officials in Arab Gulf countries. Without going too political, okay, it will be impossible for Israel to advance its relations with Arab countries and ignore the situation right now with our most immediate neighbors. It's an illusion that we can think that we can be good friends and close friends of the Saudis or the Emiratis and let's say the Omanis and forget our relations with our immediate neighbors, one thing. Secondly, it is absolutely essential for Israel, economically, strategically, health-wise, etc., to maintain and improve relations with countries like Jordan and Egypt, okay? Jordan, whatever happens in Jordan, and the pandemic in Jordan, water problem in Jordan, economic situation in Jordan, is of crucial strategic importance for Israel. Therefore, it is essential for Israel to try to improve relations with Jordan, think of Jordanian interests and requirements because it is good for us. That is, being good neighbors with Jordan is good for us. We're not doing them a favor, we're doing us a favor. All of these things have implications to our conduct, which is, I would say, very political. Since I don't want to give a political lecture, I would simply say that it has implications on the way we conduct ourselves in our immediate neighborhood. And I would stop here without going too political.
Yeah, I think that on this, I agree with what Meir said. Israel is, of course, in a delicate situation from the point of view of China and the US, because as we all know, there is a growing tension, and maybe the Financial Times calls this a Cold War between Donald Trump and the US and China. And of course, Israel depends and wants to have a very good economic and diplomatic and political relations with both the US and China. So on the one hand, we are in a very comfortable situation because we are not part of the trade war going on and the tensions between these two countries. But on the other hand, of course, if some Israeli companies sort of intensify their relations with the Chinese, maybe someone in Washington, D.C. will not like this, okay? And as a matter of fact, there has been some concern by the US authorities about the fact that the Chinese are here, the owners of our milk company, Tnuva, and the Chinese are constructing for us the subway system in Tel Aviv, and the Chinese are also renovating our ports in Haifa and Ashdod. And so, I mean, this is all something ongoing, and you know, our high-tech sector, we are a startup nation, and for us, the Chinese market is huge, and it is great, and the collaboration with the United States also is very important. And you know, let's remember, in November, in less than 5 months, there are going to be elections in the US. And who knows, maybe something will change after the elections in terms of the approach of the US. But I guess, as Meir said, Asia is the engine of growth in the whole world. And therefore, it has been good that more and more companies have been penetrating the Asian markets. For us at Tel Aviv University, Asia has been a very good source of all kinds of student programs. And at the College School of Management, we have almost every month a delegation of people from China, whether it is leaders from municipalities or other places. They come and get a very intensive course of 1 week on different things. And we take them to all kinds of startups, and you know, in addition to visiting Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and other places. So I think this is a great relationship, and there is one thing that we can sort of have to keep, and it is and to know that for the Chinese people have a great admiration for Israel. Okay, they have a great admiration for the Israeli people, the Israeli achievements, the Israeli technology sector, and the Israeli universities, and so on and so forth. So, as I said before, we will have to sort of manage in a very delicate way the current situation.
Absolutely reminds me, I had the blessing to work with Shimon Peres in the past, and I remember when he would meet with the Chinese ambassador, and he shared with the team after that the Chinese people, because they're an ancient people, and the Jewish people are also an ancient people, that they saw us sort of as kindred. There was a lot of affinity there, and there was a great deal of respect. And the Chinese, being an ancient civilization, valued that we were too, and that both, they saw, you know, issues of time, taking their time. We've been here for thousands of years. We, you know, a day or two, things have their time and pace, and also with us as Israel and the Jewish people. There is definitely a lot of affinity there, going a lot of way back in mutual respect. Miri, what's interesting that comes out of both what Meir and Leo said, I don't know if it's applicable to the education, and it struck me, and it sort of relates to one of the questions, but not directly. Because classrooms around the world, many of them are going online, have you seen, and as a global education expert, and I know you mentioned before that you also have about, you know, an entrepreneurship and so forth, have you seen classrooms, for example, a classroom in China and a classroom in Israel, or a classroom in Berlin? Have you seen this global pandemic enabling not just multidisciplinary learning, but learning across boundaries together? That if Leo or Meir or yourself were giving a lecture with 3 classrooms at once, is that something that's happening? Are there those types of movements also happening, which also relates in the beginning when Leo was talking about, and also a little bit of Meir and yourself, on the one hand, leadership coming together, on the other hand, pointed. Is education experiencing that, coming together at some points?
Yeah, I guess it is, especially again in this bottom-up different ventures where individual teachers and even families get in touch and create these small ventures that collaborate at various levels. I think the issue with education is, as always, is scalability. How to take this small initiative, which is very successful as a startup, and to make it work on a national or regional scale. So in higher education, obviously, it's easier to implement. I think that at the first stage of the pandemic, the world was in a survival mode, especially schools and higher education institutions. I assume that as we are heading to the next academic year, we will see more initiative like that. And certainly now people got used to work more online, feel more comfortable in such ways of communication. So I believe this field will be developing rapidly, especially in terms of commercial interests, and obviously then the governments will follow.
Amazing. I understand, as usual, we're in Israel, we're in the Middle East, that we've gone over time. And I know Orit wants to say something, but to sort of bring it together, one of our wonderful community members from Italy, she shared a very interesting insight that maybe is a nice way to sort of wrap up. She says, and this was her insight, it seems, mine's not a question, but rather reflection, an addenda to what Professor Leiderman anticipated on nationalism. It seems that recently the world is facing a rise of silent nationalism, which I would humbly name it as vaccine nationalism. Not only authoritarian regimes feel resurrected, but that some of them are practically imitating the US role on World War II events. that here that there's the balance. What I see it as, what this comment of this wonderful woman from Italy was, a balance between what you all had talked about, the community level, the local level, the national level, with also the global level. It's somehow finding a balance together. I know, Orit, you want to wrap up.
Wow, well, and just on that note, Jill, if we're talking about the themes that we've been talking about, learning across boundaries and looking at the opportunities that have come out of this crisis, which I think all of you touched on in different ways. If our participants enjoyed and were intrigued by these topics, I just wanted to let you know that we are opening an online summer course starting on July 4th, exactly on the topic of COVID-19, called From Crisis to Opportunity. And if we are from Philly or Italy or in Israel, you're welcome to join this course. It's a 2-credit course for 4 weeks. And the few faculty members that we have here are going to be part of a much larger syllabus. So we'll send something over in the chat. In addition, if you're interested in TAU International, we'll also send you our contact details in the chat. And most importantly, thank you so much, everyone, for participating, both as panelists, as hosts, and as participants. We look forward to seeing you in person, as Jill said, next time.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jill. Thank you.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Thank
you.
you.
Hey, everybody.
I'll just leave the info in the chat just quickly.
So I've already put in the COVID.
Okay, thanks, Shira.
Right, yeah, for sure.
So I think we should end and then connect. We're still live on Facebook.
Yes. Thank you, everybody watching on Facebook. Thank you so much for joining us, whether now or later on. Bye.